It's Monday, December the 19th, and this is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Laura Farris, Labour MP Rushanara Ali, Times radio political correspondent Charlotte Ivers and Spiked columnist Ella Whelan. Today,
I'm keen to continue a dialogue with the trade unions because there's a range of issues that matter to staff.
We are prepared to talk to you, but they will not talk to us about the elephant in the room, which is pay.
no sign of a breakthrough as nurses, paramedics, border force staff and civil servants prepare to strike.
This is just the first court to hear this case, and we believe, and our lawyers have told us, that we probably do have grounds to carry on fighting.
The High Court rules the government does have the legal power to send asylum seekers to Rwanda.
I was walking down a really busy street with my headphones in when a guy told me that I was sexy, making comments about me, about my body.
Will a new law put a stop to sexual harassment on the streets? And why an e-scooter might not be an ideal Christmas gift. Well, let's start with strikes. Let's just show you this calendar of who is striking when. You get there the flavour of what is going to happen as the week unfolds. Nurses tomorrow, ambulance drivers on Wednesday, and various transport workers and Border Force and Royal Mail across the rest of the week. You heard the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, and union leader there in the headlines. There's no resolution thus far. The government isn't budging. So my opening question to the panel is, starting with you, Laura, can the government hold the line on pay?
Well, I always sort of hate seeing industrial relations when they're reduced to the point where there's a kind of hostility that's developed between the union and the government. I mean, this is quite common. I hope that there is a way through on this. I think that, it is important, just particularly in the health service, to look back at what the pay review body has said, because the reason it was set up was to take the politics out of it, that it would balance everything from recruitment and retention and affordability and motivational type issues and come up with an independent recommendation that would be out of the hands of any particular politician. And it did come up with a recommendation for nurses.
Quite a long time ago and ahead of soaring inflation.
And it did concede that it wouldn't match inflation. I do accept that there may be some movement, but I think it is right to say that the government did accept it in full. And so...
should they continue to do that?
Well, I think it's right that that is the starting point rather than the request that the RCN has made, which is, I mean, it is a very high request of 19% if you take RPA.
But 4.75%?
Yep, they're a long way apart.
5% and 19%. Your colleagues like Caroline Noakes have said the government needs to make an improved offer.
Well, look, all I can say is this, because I'm just a backbench MP and I'm not part of this negotiation, but I think the biting effect of inflation is impacting everybody. The pay offer that's been made so far is worth 9% to the lowest paid nurses, and I think that that the government would say that they have to consider carefully the overall NHS budget, because increasing nurses' pay or any particular category of NHS
but where's your gut?
So I think that the reality is that these things never resolve without further negotiation. I think the government is right to hold the line on where they've got to, but I think that, I think some of the hostility you're seeing, particularly in the last 24 hours, is a result of perhaps a lack of dialogue, and that is the starting point.
It's difficult, isn't it? Just listening to Laura sitting there, difficult to find a balance between saying the government must move, as 5 Conservative MPs have said, a small number, admittedly, and whether the government can hold the line.
I think it is, and I'd be quite reluctant of making predictions of where we are this time next month. What we do know is that the public do seem to support, particularly nurses striking, more than strikes as a general concept. They seem to have public support behind them in a way that is almost out of kilter with opinion polling on every other front. And so I think the nurses' union do find themselves in a particularly strong position. And as a result of that, I wonder whether if the government does move on any front, it will be this one specifically.
And will they be able to differentiate and distinguish in terms of other workers like the railway workers, for example?
But that is the problem, isn't it? Because the minute that you concede on one front, everyone else will be saying, well, hang on, you managed to find the magic money tree with the nurses. How about us? Clearly, when you say there is no money, actually, there is some flexibility. So the government are in a really tricky position here, because if they move one part of the chessboard, suddenly everything else collapses around it.
Where are you, Ella?
I don't think it's difficult at all. I mean, what the demands that nurses are making, 19% pay rises, equivalent to about £10 billion. That's 6.5% of the NHS budget. That, to me, that strikes as a bargain to make sure that the people that keep us alive are economically sound and content in their jobs. You can't. There's this kind of cognitive dissonance that the government's working with, in which you've been, spent 2 years asking people to clap for nurses and all the rest of it, and then now won't cough up with the, let's face it, still relatively meagre. This isn't like flying to Barbados kind of wages. Demands that nurses are making, find it within the budget, make some, we're always talking about how much wastage there is in the NHS, cut cleverly somewhere else and pay the people who really matter. But I think, it's an interesting point about the difference between nurses and rail workers. I mean, on the issue of strikes, I think what the nurses and healthcare workers who are taking industrial action have to be careful of is playing this game of sort of emotionalism, because of course, when a nurse goes on strike, there's a greater possibility of death than when a rail worker goes on strike. Everybody knows that because of the nature of the work. But at the end of the day, they are both wage labourers. They are both people who are working and who need to take industrial action to make sure their conditions or their pay is satisfactory. And so they shouldn't be, this kind of emotional blackmail has kept nurses from being able to, and healthcare workers from being able to take strike action for far too long. So that's a kind of, I wouldn't make a distinction between the two. They're all workers.
I'll come to you in just a moment, Roshanara. Your response to what Ella's just said?
Well, I think that, I think just coming back actually to what Charlotte said about the fact that I think that the public have got higher support for the nurses' strike than other categories of worker, and I've seen that statistic too. And I think one of the things that can be quite dangerous is that you sort of get into this moral value type exercise with workers where people recognise the work of nurses, it's visible, and you can end up in a situation where a sort of emotional argument says, well, these people, have a very valuable job and somebody doing a boring job behind the scenes isn't worth as much. And in fact, I think you have to be a bit more dispassionate with paid negotiations. I do take your point, Ella, about pay and affordability and about paying people the right wages, but as well as everybody on the panel does, that current inflation rates are at the highest level of, I think, all of our lifetimes, and that has created problems in the private and in the public sector.
But you can't, I think, it's, the government can't have just gone through what it went through in the last few years. The magic money tree was found 1 million times over throughout the pandemic, and I don't think anyone's going to criticise the government for doing that. But that whole argument of, coffers are empty thing doesn't really work anymore, because you make political decisions. It's within a government's realms of possibility to make political decisions to make it happen. You can't keep relying on this, there is no alternative argument.
Well, I don't think that's... the government have accepted that nurses should get a pay rise, and they've made an offer already of 5%. Right. But the point is really whether it's high enough.
I'm going to bring in Roshanara, because the front bench, Labour front bench, have rejected 19%, which is the demand from the Royal College of Nursing, RPI in level of inflation plus 5%. Do you think the government can hold the line and should hold the line?
I don't think the government should be holding a line not to negotiate with public sector workers.
I was asking specifically on pay.
On pay, they need to negotiate, because it's not just in the nursing sector, and they haven't been on strike for over 100 years. It is railway workers. It's across the board in the legal justice system. This government has basically caused a shutdown of our economy, destroyed our economy, our public services, and nothing works. And people are fed up with it. So the government needs to get back on the negotiating table and discuss pay as well as conditions, and get the country moving again. That's what's not happening. Now, in the time that we were in power, we didn't have this sort of industrial action because negotiations happened.
And you would like to see the Labour front bench perhaps suggest something closer to inflation?
Compromises were made, but the negotiations need to be made by the government.
Well, have a look at this on the front page of the Daily Mail. Outrage, it says the headline, at Gary Neville's World Cup rant over UK strikes. This is the football pundit Gary Neville comparing the conditions for striking nurses and railway staff here to those faced by migrant workers in Qatar, of which there's been much debate. Rushanara, was he right to make that comparison?
Well, I don't think it's comparable. These are very different societies and countries, and he's made his viewpoint as he has. But I think what's really
because he is a Labour Party member.
What's really important is that the UK does what it can to ensure there are decent international labour standards. The International Labour Organisation is an organisation that the Conservative Party, when they came into power, cut the funding for. That actually saves lives. So I think what's important is that we play our part. But these are two separate arguments. But of course, we need to be mindful of protecting people's rights and labour standards in our own country. So
but should he have said it then? You say they're different. Should he have said it at all?
I think that that's a matter for him. What I'm concerned about is making sure we protect labour standards in our own country as well as internationally. And governments can play a really important role in making that happen.
Well, the Number 10 spokesperson has said the comments by Gary Neville were neither legitimate nor appropriate. Laura, I want to show you this because the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, has been visiting a hospital today. He was confronted by a mother whose daughter has cystic fibrosis. Let's take a look.
We have a daughter with a life-limiting, a life-shortening condition, and we have some brilliant experts, and they're being worked to the bone, and actually the level of care they provide is amazing, but they're not being able to provide it in the way they want to provide it because the resourcing is not there, Like I said, on Monday we were due to be in, and the number of people coming through the door is too many, and it's not fair to blame it on the pandemic anymore, is it? Because actually we had problems in the NHS before we went into the pandemic. We were short of doctors, we were short of beds going into the pandemic. So I think it's really wrong to blame it on the pandemic. And actually the damage that you're doing to families like myself is terrible.
What do you think of that, Laura? Do you think she's right? You can't blame all this on the pandemic.
Well, look, that's a very emotive conversation by a mother who's dealing with the NHS in a very direct way because of her child.
She won't be the only one, of course.
No, of course not. Do I accept there's a huge amount of pressure on the NHS, which I think was the kernel of her complaint? Yes, I do accept that. And I don't think I've suggested that it was all a result of the pandemic.
But I think the government, she's implying that the government has, and the idea that this has all come about as a result of the war in Ukraine, the pandemic, is not true, she says.
No, I accept that, and I think there have been structural issues with the NHS for decades, actually.
And the Tories have been in government since 2010.
But I think they predate that, and I don't think they're actually the responsibility of any particular political party in government. What I do think, though, is that the pandemic and things like the effect of inflation haven't helped with some of the issues that she's describing.
Rushanara?
Well, when Labour left power in 2010, the NHS had the highest public satisfaction level ever recorded. And since then, what we've seen is mismanagement and underinvestment. We went into the pandemic with the government cutting support to the NHS.
And that was during the crash, the financial crash.
Now we have 7 million people on waiting lists. We've seen the NHS brought to its knees, and the government is not actually dealing with the substantive issues facing the NHS. They, as we said earlier, they were clapping NHS workers during the pandemic. And now what we have is a neglect, and that needs to be resolved.
Charlotte?
I think there's several things going on here, really, which is why it's so intractable. I certainly had a conversation with one of my colleagues at the Sunday Times, our health editor, the other day, where I was essentially saying, can the NHS continue to exist in its current form? Because you do have an ageing population. I was essentially saying, look, when I get old and need the NHS, is it still going to be there? And he said that actually it wasn't necessarily just a structural problem, that if funding had kept up with other European countries, we would be in a significantly different position when it came to the amount of money in the system. But it's not just money as well, because, of course, you do have an incredibly slow pace of change in parts of the NHS. It is very difficult to move such a huge organisation quickly. And so there are two different things going on there, which then combine, of course, because if you just said, right, tomorrow, massive cash injection, there are all these different parts which aren't working as effectively as they could be. And therefore, just suddenly throwing a bunch of money at it wouldn't put it back to the place it could have been had there been long-term reform and cash injections over a series of decades.
Your observations of the NHS, if you've had any personal experience recently?
Yeah, I had a baby 2 months ago, and the women who looked after me were beyond knackered. The care that I got wasn't great. And it was very clear that there was, that it wasn't working as it should do. And actually, that's been the experience of maternity wards all over the country. And we've had some, discussion about terrible scandals that are happening in that particular area of healthcare. But I mean, these strikers are not trying to start a conversation about the status of the NHS and all that kind of thing. They are arguing for their individual and collective right to have, enact industrial action and get better wages. I mean, it really is quite tiresome listening to all this gas and air from politicians about, well, when we had the NHS, it was great, but now it's your fault, now it's your fault. Why don't you actually, face the question, which is, are you going to meet this pay demand? Neither of your parties are. Neither of your parties want to meet the 19% pay raise. And for an individual nurse, that's all that matters. I don't want to hear about your apologies for, doing the clapping. Don't want to hear about whose fault it is. Just want to hear that you're going to do something. And at the end of the day, negotiations are just, I think for a lot of people, we understand now that negotiations are a byword for government saying just kick it into the long grass, keep stalling, keep stalling. For a worker, that doesn't, that doesn't cut it. Meet their demands or not.
These are politicians here. Do you accept that? Should those demands be met?
I don't think they should be met, because I heard the head of the Royal College of Nursing herself on Newsnight about a week ago stepping back quite significantly from the 19% and taking umbrage, actually, even the suggestion that that was still the request and that she was much more flexible than that. So and I also think you do have to consider the taxpayer, because the truth is we pay public sector workers. And so when you consider whether a 20% pay rise, which is effectively how it has been presented, is appropriate, you have to think about the impact on other taxpayers and on their disposable income. And that's the point of a pay review body, that it balances everything: the tax take, the budget to the NHS, the overall remuneration that's given to other members of staff of the NHS, and also supporting private sectors. None of this is easy, but it can be quite easy to say, well, you should give nurses what they want. And that is actually would be an irresponsible thing.
Well, let me get Rishanara to respond to your demand in that sense, which is meet the pay demands and stop talking about it was better in my day.
We're not in power. The question was asked about the state of the NHS. And that's what I was responding to. And what we had is the current government, chopping and changing the Lansley reform, a lot of
the top-down reforms under Cameron,
which caused disruption. And also we've got a lack of training, investment in training of nurses and doctors. So these are systemic issues that do need to be addressed. The point about negotiation is it's not about kicking the can. It is about making sure that the negotiations between the government of the day and the workers actually happen. If we don't, we're going to end up stuck in this gridlock, and that needs to be unlocked by the government of the day.
All right.
So this is not academic. It's not an academic point. It's a serious point.
Let's have a look at this breaking news which has come out in the last hour or so. We've been expecting it, and that is a High Court decision on the government's Rwanda policy. Let's have a look at the tweets from my colleague Dominic Casciani, the BBC Home Affairs correspondent. High Court rules that the British government's plan to send some asylum seekers from the UK to Rwanda to have their claims considered there is lawful and doesn't breach the Refugee Convention or human rights laws. The court, however, rules that each of the 8 individual migrants in this case who had arrived by small boats were treated unlawfully. The Home Secretary's officials must reconsider their cases, but the fundamental point is the Rwanda scheme is lawful. Is that something to celebrate, Laura?
Well, the Rwanda scheme is a product of the fact that we have got a problem with small boat arrivals in Kent and on the south coast. And it's not about whether it's something to celebrate. It's about, well, first of all, the principle of removal of asylum seekers to a safe third country was a Labour policy. It's in the 2004 Asylum Act. Schedule 3 of that sets out the principle. And the issue for the court was whether Rwanda was capable of amounting to a safe country. whether there was a risk that if people were sent there, they would be persecuted again, whether their asylum claims would be safely processed, whether they would be kept safe, whether they would have opportunities, or whether they would be sent back to unsafe places. All of those questions were litigated in the High Court, and on all of them, the government has been found to have acted lawfully. In fact, Rwanda is a signatory to the Refugee Convention, so it's bound by those obligations anyway, but that wasn't the limits of the decision. So I think just as a point of principle on Human Rights Act, on the interpretation of the 1951 Convention, I think it was the right decision, and I also think it was a foreseeable decision, because when the case was litigated through that, all the way to the Supreme Court, actually in the summer, at the interim stage, you'll recall there was an injunction of the sort. The government won on that as well, so it is consistent with that judgment.
You must be disappointed by the decision, because Labour have said that that's one piece of the policy to deal with small boat crossings that they can't support, and they would definitely drop it. Do you want to change your mind about it because it's now been deemed lawful?
It's completely disappointing, absolutely, but the court has made its ruling, but it is unethical and it's costly. And it's unworkable. And what we need to do is make sure that the Home Office backlog is addressed for those who are applying now. There are thousands of people waiting for a very long time.
Well, Rishi Sunak has said there are going to be more people employed.
They've been in power for 12 years. They haven't got a grip on the asylum system. The second thing is there are millions of people who are refugees in other parts of the world. And I do a lot of work on those issues. So what does that say to other countries? That they should start deporting people? You know, Bangladesh hosts 1 million. Jordan hosts well over 1 million, and Lebanon, all those countries are hosting refugees. So should they be deporting people on planes to other countries? That causes chaos. We need to get a grip on our system. The NCA needs to be properly funded to deal with organised criminal gangs. The government is not getting a grip on those issues. This is, again, another distraction. It's not going to deal with the substance of the problem, and that's what people want, the government to get a grip on the asylum system.
How significant a decision is this for the government?
I think the fact that the government has won on the general policy will be taken very seriously in Downing Street. It's something that is a positive for them in getting this through. But I think the fact that you do have the court also saying, right, all of the 8 people who are involved in this were not treated lawfully does give us a sense of the fact that this is very much not over for the government. These specific cases are incredibly complex. They are incredibly legally complex. And every single time the government tries to put someone on a flight, they will go through this same litigation process. And every single time they will face this challenge, and it will be expensive. It will take a long time. And in most cases, by the looks of it, if we look at the data we've got today, they are going to lose. So this is not the end for the government at all, but nonetheless, a minor victory on their front, I would say.
Oh, right. You think it's a minor victory, and Rushanar has said it's unethical and unworkable, even if it's deemed lawful, or certainly the principle of it. But the heart of this is that it was supposed to be a deterrent. And that is why the government wanted to see this through. And Suella Braverman has said that it was her ambition, her dream, I think, to see a flight go to Rwanda with asylum seekers to have their claims actually processed there. So far, no one's gone. Could it be a deterrent?
Well, we know that deterrents of this kind just don't work. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. It doesn't work. People still arrive in increasingly dangerous means. And, you know, you cannot be a politician, particularly in this government, crying about the fact that crocodile tears, I might add, most of the time it seems like, about deaths in the sea, at the same time as using, you know, phrases like hostile environment. I mean, Kenan Malik in his Observer column over the weekend described this as the immigration and asylum system as a theatre of cruelty. At one level, this is pretty much about trying to send messages to a voting public about the fact that we're getting serious on immigration. And it's not just unworkable. I would, you know, make the distinction between things being legal and things being illegal and things being politically unsound, because, you know, I'm glad that the court has made this decision, because I think it's a problem for, you know, democratically, that a government can't make policy and can't enact that policy and being hamstrung by lawyers left, right and centre. That, you know, that's an issue in the abstract.
OK.
But part of this, you know, we have to talk more holistically, not just about the specifics of deportation or the asylum system, but also about what we think about immigration in this country. There's this kind of sort of facetious idea that because people voted Brexit or, whatever, that we're all sort of champing on the bit to put people on deportation flights. Actually, it's much more complex than that, and we haven't had an open discussion about immigration.
Briefly, Charlotte, because we've got a guest to go to.
I would slightly say being hamstrung by lawyers probably isn't what happens, because the government makes the laws and then the lawyers enforce them. If they aren't happy with the laws being enforced, they should change the laws, and they have the capacity to do that.
Alp Mehmet from the pressure group Migration Watch joins us now. Your response to the High Court's decision, the ruling?
I welcome it. I think it's a step in the right direction. It remains to be seen now what the government will do and whether or not the process that has been stalled with removals to Rwanda will be restarted. I hope it does. And if it does, I think it will help. It will actually help to send the right message that if you get here illegally across the channel, you won't be able to stay.
Rushanara?
We had a Conservative MP on a select committee point out that the legal routes for those seeking refuge in our country have almost all but diminished. So I think what the government does need to do is do the work that needs to be done to prevent those who are exploiting desperate people seeking refuge, to stop the problem at source, and also make sure there is a proper pathway for people to be able to apply for refugee status through a legal mechanism, particularly women and children. They are the most exploited and vulnerable, and we just don't have a system that's working, and that's what needs to be addressed.
Alp Mehmet, would you want to respond? That was Rushanara Ali, the Labour MP.
Well, most of those coming across the channel are actually male. They are young working age males, so it's not the case that everyone is actually a refugee. And when people talk about this
that's
having
why the
safe
traffickers,
routes,
with respect, the traffickers need to be
safe and legal
tackled.
routes. Having safe and legal routes, do they really understand what that means? Whether you're going to set up application points around Europe, around France, and if people are going to be able to go to these application points and submit an application, that they'll be overrun within days, frankly. And what happens at the point where they're either refused or indeed their applications are denied? It just doesn't make sense, frankly. This decision today to remove people to Rwanda, where they're going to be helped to set up new lives, I think is the right one and is to be welcomed.
Rushanara?
Well, one thing I would say is that it's really important that we have the partnership with the French government. We make sure that there are appropriate negotiations to prevent people being exploited getting on those boats, because people are dying en route. We saw that
last week, 4 people dead.
And the point is that we've seen with the Ukraine crisis, the government has introduced some mechanisms for appropriate, safe ways for those who
Hong Kong,
need
Ukraine, Afghanistan.
So there are ways in which they can do the right things, and there are lessons to be learnt, and they're choosing not to. So if there is the political will to sort this out, they can, and actually they're not dealing with the fundamentals here, and the trafficking issue cannot be addressed without supporting the NCA, without negotiations with the French to set up a system.
Let me bring in the others.
Prevent people being exploited like that.
Hang on a second, hang on a second, Alp, and I'll come back to you, Ella, and then I'll come to
Alp is right in pointing out the fact that those of us who want to have a more liberal immigration system, of which I am one, have to stop kind of pretending that the only people coming over in small boats are extremely vulnerable women fleeing some kind of persecution. But the solution, doesn't have to be how do you crack down harder. You could actually take a look at, politicians in this country are constantly going on about labour shortages and the need to, fill positions left, right, and centre. And our points-based system, begun under Labour government and expanded under the Conservatives, is incredibly stringent. It's prevents the working class of Europe from entering this country. You have to have a PhD, you have to high-paid job, you have to be, of the kind of European bourgeoisie to be able to get in here. Why not take a chance? Suggest that these young men who are willing to come and try and make a better life for themselves come through safe and legal means, become citizens and contribute to the society in the same way.
I'm going to get you to respond, Laura, but Alp, you were laughing then, or scoffing. I don't quite know which.
Well, the points-based system has had some sort of constraining effect. It hasn't. It's done the opposite, frankly. But going back to working with the French, yes, if only the French were prepared to take people back in the way that
they have stopped about
we would
40%.
like them to.
They have stopped about 40% of the crossings.
No,
Alp.
the other thing is, with regards, sorry to interrupt you, but with regard to the French, they allow 20% of asylum applications. 20%. We allow at first instance 75%. The EU generally accepts only 39%, so roughly half the rates that we accept. It's simply wrong that we're not doing our bit. And frankly, 1.1 million people coming here long term with a net migration of over 500,000 is absolutely absurd, and why it has to be controlled. Immigration has to be reduced.
Do you agree with that, Laura? I mean, I'll just show people the headline, perhaps referencing some of the figures Alp was quoting there. The Daily Mail, 1 million migrants a year will soon be the norm after figures showed a rise of 435,000 year on year, according to a think tank. Of the 1.1 million entry clearance grants in the year to June 22, different to net migration, because, of course, that takes in the numbers of people leaving.
I don't know what the empirical basis is for that, so I'm not going to comment on it. But what I will say, with the small boats, they provoked a specific and distinct problem. In 2020, just 2 years ago, 8,000 people made the crossing by small boat. We're now on track for 45,000 people to make that
that's since
crossing.
the policy was announced in April, so it hasn't acted as a deterrent, has it?
But the policy hasn't been enacted. No flight has taken off. And if I just can make a couple of points, of those 45,000, 13,000 are Albanian and 11,500 of them are young men. So the possibility, as Ella says, actually, that not every single person is a refugee, or that there should be the possibility of returns to safe countries. There's been a deal announced with Albania, and the High Court today has said that in accordance with human rights principles and the Refugee Convention, Rwanda is also a safe country. And the point of Rwanda...
Why did the government cut the funding of the NCA? These agencies can actually help to prevent people being exploited, people being put on boats that are dangerous and risky and dying while trying to come to the UK. Why are they doing these things? Because if they're serious about tackling this problem at source, then they would do that. And also, you know, since we left the EU, it means that we don't have the arrangements that we had with the French. The Dublin Agreement does need to be...
It was never very successful.
But we do need a new arrangement.
Well, let Laura respond, Rishanara, to those comments about Dublin.
So I've done a number of cases in the immigration tribunals on Dublin 3. It was very difficult to remove, and overall we ended up having more people than removing them. It didn't really work for various human rights related reasons.
Calling the French president a foe by Liz Truss isn't exactly particularly helpful in damaging relations with the French.
I take that point, but I think there has been a new constructive relationship between the Prime Minister and the French President. I think you've seen that in the last few weeks. The Prime Minister did talk about funding for the NCA in his announcement last week, and also safe and legal routes.
That was 12 years after being in government, with respect.
But you say there's no safe and
better late than never.
But you say there's no safe and legal routes. But since March of this year, we've taken 150,000 Ukrainian
That was a Conservative MP.
people.
His words, not mine.
We've taken 100.
Well, don't talk over each other. Go on.
Right, well, I don't want to have a disagreement. But we have. I mean, just one scheme, the Homes for Ukraine scheme, 150,000 people now living safely in the United Kingdom. As I say, I take your point on safe and legal
as an example of where.
All right.
Good work can be done.
Alp Mehmet, thank you very much for joining us today on that decision from the High Court. Now, you may remember a film that we showed a few years ago. Just a warning, some of the language you may find offensive. Let's take a look.
I was walking down a really busy street with my headphones in when a guy told me that I was sexy and had a great ass. When I ignored him, he started saying really aggressive things, calling me
Your big chest makes men want to come at you. Don't push away cute guys.
A guy told me that if I kept eating, I would no longer be pretty and that no guy would ever want me.
The Our Streets Now campaign is run by sisters 21-year-old Maya and 15-year-old Gemma. They want to make street harassment illegal and are collecting stories of other women's experiences. It all started when Gemma was walking to meet a friend.
These two men in a white van, very cliche, I know, but they slowed down and basically followed me down this street, making comments about me, about my body, about what I was wearing. and it just absolutely terrified me.
So that campaign now has government backing to a private member's bill from the former Business Secretary Greg Clark to make street harassment a criminal offence. Is this legislation a good idea, Laura?
It's a very good idea. First of all, street harassment is already a public order offence, and when I've worked with women in my constituency and in the campaign groups, very often women don't know they can report it, and the few that I've met who did report it got quite a patchy response from the police. So this new offence will be located in the public order offences where it already exists, but it will create a distinct offence so that both the police and the public know what they're dealing with.
Ella?
Just one other point.
Yes.
We already have sexual harassment prohibitions in the civil
Indeed.
context under the Equality Act. And that already has, because I think one of the things you might be getting at is it reasonable? Is it too low level? Will wolf whistles, you know? It won't, because in the civil sense, there's already, in the statutory language, a sort of barrier that prevents de minimis claims. It imposes a reasonableness test, and I see no reason why that couldn't be applied in the criminal context too.
Seems perfectly credible.
No, it doesn't to me. I think this is a terrible idea, and that's not because I'm an apologist for street harassment or think the kind of words that were labelled at those women in that video are in any way morally right. But because, you've already said there's plenty of laws on the statute books to deal with this kind of like ridiculous idea that all the police need is another law to kind of get them to get off their backsides and, do the job properly is a nonsense. In fact, I think as someone who's... That
happened with stalking, for example. There was already prohibitions of stalking from the 90s, but they made it a distinct offence in 2012 because police didn't react well enough to the prevention from harassment legislation that sort of dealt with it. So sometimes a distinct offence really helps.
There's a more important point to this, which is that, listening to Greg Clark talk about why he wants to bring in this law, made this really big point about, we want to change the culture. And how we change the culture is by instituting law. I completely disagree with that. I think it's a real problem for women's freedom, of which I care about very deeply, that you suggest that we need more intervention from the state, either through legislation or through cops watching us, on the street and looking after us like knights in shining armour. That's a real problem for a sense of women's agency and women's freedom. There's also this ridiculous idea that the men who are shouting sexy legs or whatever worse stuff at women have no concept that it's wrong. Don't know that it's illegal, don't know that it's a bad thing. And Greg Clark coming along and saying, now lads, you'll get locked up for doing it is going to stop it. You have to, in order to enact social change in favour of women's freedom, it has to be done on an organic social basis. And you're not, simply kind of rubber stamping something in Parliament is not going to do anything.
Well, let's pick up on that point about it being or becoming more of a social taboo. That you say, Greg Clark saying, lads, that's enough. Might there be a change with a law like this that makes it harder or makes some people think you shouldn't be doing that?
I think it's entirely plausible, and I do think that there's a very good case to be made that making it very clear that things are illegal, upskirting, good example, does change the attitude around them. All of that being said, I don't know. I find this a very complex one because I was on the tube home the other night and some guy sat down next to me and was harassing me, and it was absolutely awful. So the idea that I could prosecute him, great news, would love it. The problem is, though, we keep getting these new laws of new things on this front that are now illegal. But when you look at the absolute basic things that just should be prosecuted, so rape, for example, only 1.3% of reported rapes even get a charge, and that's before you even get into court, and obviously that's usually delayed, and then below that you have an even lower conviction rate. So we're basically at the point where we've got rape almost legal in this country, and we're worrying about all sorts of other different things when you've got this massive glaring problem at the centre. And I almost just want to say, let's put all our energy into that, fixing that problem, and then we can worry about someone shouting at me on the street.
Laura?
Yeah, well, you're right. There has been a problem with rape convictions, and the rape review that the government did last year prompted some major changes in the way that rapes are investigated, the way that they're referred to the CPS and the charging decisions that follow. And there was some data published last week that regrettably got completely lost that showed that rape prosecutions are up 65% on where they were this time last year. It's not good enough, but it does show that what they're doing is sending it into the right direction. I take your point on rape, and I actually take your point, Ella, too, about culture. And I do know what I think you're both sort of saying. Too much tinkering around the edges doesn't really get women anywhere, and I am actually receptive to that argument. The one thing I would say is that there is a lot of gateway stuff, though, which does lead to more violent offending. Even, for example, just watching violent porn online, which is lawful, but frequent, and can really contribute to deeply misogynistic attitudes that end up being exhibited in a much more serious way elsewhere. So I suppose stuff like that is in the online safety bill, but that's much more targeted at children rather than people overall. And I still think that there are sort of gateway issues that need to be...
I just want to get... Do you support this bill?
Well, we'll look very closely at what's on the table, and it needs to be carefully defined for the very reasons that have been pointed out, and it's got to be backed by proper resources of the police service to do the prosecutions, to bring the convictions on rape, for instance, on the serious crimes. And on stalking, as somebody who's experienced stalking during my teens as well as a Member of Parliament, what I can tell you is that without the proper resourcing and mental health support as well, because in some cases with stalking you get a mental health dimension, actually not a great deal happens for a very long time, and vulnerable women can find themselves in extreme danger. So I think the substance needs to be addressed on rape, on stalking and all the other crimes. And if this particular proposal does change attitude and behaviour, we can look at that, but we need to get the substance right.
Briefly,
crimes. To make a cheap point first, there's a problem in the police force at the moment with attitudes towards women. So the idea that all these police officers are now going to come along and treat women really well is dubious, and I also think it's cynical that a government, a minister is coming along and being the knight in shining armour for women at a time when, polls are looking less than favourable for government. That aside, I'm not tinkering around the edges with this. I think that it's fundamentally a problem for women that you make more and more aspects of public social interaction illegal. If something might be uncomfortable, something might be unpleasant, but it shouldn't be illegal. And I think talking about women's freedom is important here, because we don't want protection. Protection and safety is very different from freedom, which is an active, important political principle. And I think we're damaging women's freedom by suggesting that we need all these protective laws to encompass us as we walk down the street.
We're going to talk about e-scooters coming up to Christmas. They tend to inspire strong reaction. People love them or loathe them. BBC reporter Shelley Phelps has covered the experiences of Angharad Paget-Jones, a blind woman who was hit by an e-scooter and who is now frightened and anxious of them. Let's have a look.
I got hit nearly flat on.
If they're found to be using their e-scooters illegally, they could face having their e-scooters seized.
The law needs to catch up to the technology.
Electric scooters have become a familiar sight across the UK. You might have them in your town or city as part of hire trials, or maybe you've seen someone riding a privately owned one on the road illegally.
They're just everywhere. There seems to be no safe space. You can't cross a road without one running a red light. You can't work through the city centre without one just cutting off your path.
Angharad and her guide dog Tudor encounter e-scooters regularly in Cardiff, where she works.
I got hit nearly flat on by one. If my friend hadn't pulled Tudor out of the way, he would have been hit, so I took the brunt of it. It was a few bruises and some scrapes, so I got off quite luckily because obviously we had been pulled out the way, so only like half of me got hit. But yeah, if my dog had got hit, that was the scariest part.
The incident has had a lasting effect.
You should question every step, or you should just be able to work through and it's fine. And Tudor himself now, like hears one or sees one coming and he'll stop.
If you buy an e-scooter, you can only use it on private land with the landowner's permission. Some police forces are urging people to think twice before gifting one for Christmas, as the recipient could end up on the wrong side of the law.
If they're found to be using their e-scooters illegally, they could face having their e-scooters seized and they're unlikely to get them back. They could end up going to court for driving otherwise in accordance with a licence and using a vehicle with no insurance. And the sort of penalties they could face for that would be a fine, penalty points on their licence or a driving disqualification.
Riders and manufacturers want to see private e-scooters legalised on roads.
It's just that the law needs to catch up to the technology. I mean, they're cheap, they're economical, and they're environmentally friendly, to operate. And with the expansion of low emission zones cropping up all over the country, from London to Birmingham, Liverpool, and all these different places, they're an automatic answer to helping reduce vehicle traffic and therefore reducing carbon emissions.
So, Charlotte, the government says while riding a privately owned e-scooter on public land is currently illegal, it's considering how best to design future regulations. What are your thoughts about them?
I think that anything that gets cars out of city centres when they don't need to be there is obviously a good thing. But as we've just seen in that video there are clearly very serious questions around what can be done when, and making sure that that legislation is done properly is obviously the key thing the government will have to focus on. Will say, I think the electric bikes, the ones that help you pedal, those seem to be the thing that most people I know actually like using. And I wonder if we focus too much on e-scooters because they're new and exciting, whereas actually we had it there all along in terms of what we should be using.
I mean, I think there's a limiter on speed. It might be going beyond my technical expertise here to be able to differentiate. But what's your view about e-scooters at all, and whether it can be enforced in terms of getting them off the road if they're illegal?
There are these pilots, so we need to make sure that lessons are learnt from that and there's a proper legislative framework for them. But I worry about them as it is at the moment, because you see it when you're walking down the street. On pavements you'll see e-scooters, and if there are families, children, mums with buggies or elderly people, you notice how disruptive that is, and it can be very dangerous. So we need to make sure the government speeds up the process of making sure there's a proper framework for safety. Otherwise, frankly, they're a huge problem and a huge distraction.
That's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests. I'll be back with the last Politics Live of the year tomorrow. I'll be joined by Jacob Rees-Mogg and Stella Creasy, amongst others. That's on at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. From all of us, bye-bye.